There is a beach on the eastern coast of England, in the county of Norfolk, where the sea has been slowly eating the land for as long as anyone can remember. The cliffs there are made of soft sand and clay, and every winter the storms come in off the North Sea and take another small bite out of them, and the beach below changes. Some mornings, after a particularly heavy night of wind and tide, the people who walk that beach in the cold dawn find new things lying on the sand. Bones of old animals, pieces of flint, the dark seams of ancient riverbeds, exposed for the first time in nearly 1 million years. And one morning in May of 2013, after a particularly bad winter of storms, the people walking on that beach found something that no one had ever seen before. They found footprints, a scatter of them, pressed into a hard grey surface that had just been uncovered by the retreating sea. Footprints of adults and of children, walking together across what had once, almost 1 million years ago, been the muddy estuary of a great river that no longer exists. And when those footprints were measured and photographed and analysed, the answer that came back changed everything we thought we knew about the human story of these islands. The footprints were nearly 900,000 years old. They were the oldest human footprints ever found outside of Africa. And the feet that had made them did not belong to people like you, or like me, or like anyone alive on Earth today. The first people in Britain were not us. They were not even close to us. They were a different species entirely. Something older, something stranger, something that has been gone from the world for so long that no living thing remembers what they looked like, or what they sounded like, or what they thought about as they walked, hand in hand, with their children across that long vanished riverbank. Tonight we are going to walk with them. We are going to walk back, slowly, gently, through nearly 1 million years of time, and meet, one by one, the different kinds of people who lived on this island before anyone now living was ever born. Settle in, get comfortable. The journey ahead is very long, and very old, and very quiet. Before we step any further back into deep time, take just a moment to do one small thing. If you find these long, slow journeys through the past helpful for falling asleep, or simply for resting at the end of a long day, please consider subscribing to the channel. It is free. It takes a single quiet tap, and it lets us keep making these long-form sleep documentaries for you on subjects that very few other channels will touch. While you are there, tap the little bell as well, so the next one finds its way to you when it is ready. There is no need to keep watching the screen. You can close your eyes now. You can let the room go dark around you. The voice will keep going, gently, for a long time. The story will be here whether you are awake to hear all of it or not. Sleep is not a failure of this video. Sleep is the entire point. Now, let us go back. Back past the kings and the queens. Back past the Romans and the Druids. Back past the stone circles and the long barrows. Back into a Britain that no human history book has ever really known. A Britain of cold winds and warm summers, of great rivers and vanished forests, of strange animals and stranger people, where the very shape of the land was not yet the shape we now know. To understand the world we are stepping into, we have first to let go of the map of Britain we carry in our heads. The familiar outline of the island, the long thin shape with Scotland reaching up to the north and Cornwall pointing down to the southwest. The green fields and the hedgerows and the small old towns, none of that existed yet, in any form, when the story we are going to tell begins. The very idea of Britain as an island had not yet happened. For most of the deep past, Britain was not an island at all. It was the northwestern corner of the great European peninsula, joined to what we now call France and the Netherlands and Germany by a wide flatland that geologists have come to call Doggerland. Doggerland filled the basin of what is now the southern North Sea. It was a country of rivers and marshes and low forests, of fenland and grassland and reedy meres, larger than many modern European nations. And it was home, for hundreds of thousands of years, to herds of strange animals and to scattered bands of people who were not quite people. The River Thames did not flow east into the sea where it does now. It flowed across what is now East Anglia and out into Doggerland, where it joined with the Rhine and the Meuse, and then made its way eventually into the cold Atlantic far to the north. The River Severn was different too. The very direction of the great waters was different. The coastline was somewhere else entirely. And the climate moved up and down on a great slow rhythm of glaciations and warm interglacials. Sometimes warmer than today, sometimes cold enough to bury the entire northern half of the island under a sheet of ice a kilometre thick. This is the world we are entering. Not the small green country we know now, but a vast, shifting peninsula at the edge of a vast, shifting continent, where the boundary between land and sea moved by hundreds of kilometres over the centuries, where the forests turned to tundra and back to forests again on a cycle of about 100,000 years, where the animals that walked the river valleys were larger and stranger than any animals you have ever seen in any zoo. There were straight-tusked elephants, taller at the shoulder than a modern African elephant, browsing on the leaves of oak and lime and elm. There were rhinoceroses, two different kinds of them at different times, sometimes with two horns and sometimes with one, sometimes covered in long, shaggy hair and sometimes nearly hairless. There were hippopotamuses, real hippopotamuses, wallowing in the warm river bends of southern England during the warmest of the interglacial summers, leaving their bones in the gravels of what is now Trafalgar Square, in the heart of modern London. There were lions, cave lions, larger than modern African lions, hunting across what would one day become the green meadows of the English countryside. There were spotted hyenas, the same species that still lives in Africa today, but living in Britain, denning in caves in the limestone hills of Derbyshire and Yorkshire and Somerset, leaving the gnawed bones of their prey scattered across the floors of those caves. There were giant deer, with antlers stretching 3.5 meters from tip to tip, walking in cautious herds along the edges of the great floodplains. There were aurochs, ancestors of all modern cattle, twice the size of a modern cow, with horns like swords. There were saber-toothed cats in the earliest part of the period, before they went extinct. There were narrow-nosed rhinoceroses and woolly mammoths in the colder phases, and steppe bison and wild horses and packs of wolves moving silently through the long grass. Watching everything, missing nothing. This was the world. And into this world, sometime around 900,000 years ago, walked the first people that Britain would ever know. We do not know exactly who they were. We do not have their skeletons. Not from Happisburgh itself. Not yet. What we have are their footprints, and we have the stone tools they left behind, scattered in the same ancient muddy layers. And we have, from a slightly earlier and slightly later site called Pakefield, a little further south down the coast, more of their tools. And we have, from the same time period, on the continent, in caves in northern Spain, the actual bones of the species that almost certainly made these tools and pressed these footprints into the mud. The species is called Homo antecessor. The name is Latin, and it means, more or less, the explorer, or the one who comes before. Homo antecessor was a human being, in the broadest sense of the word. They walked upright on two legs. They had hands very much like ours, with opposable thumbs, capable of fine grip and of tool-making. They had brains substantially smaller than ours, but substantially larger than any modern ape, somewhere around 1,000 cubic centimeters in volume, compared to our roughly 1,400. Their faces were strange. They had a flat midface, almost modern-looking in some ways, with a hint of the cheekbone shape we see in living humans. But they had heavy brow ridges, like a shelf of bone above the eyes, and a low forehead that sloped back rather than rising up, and a powerful jaw with a receding chin, or really no chin at all. They were tall taller than modern humans of the same period in Africa, perhaps because they had lived in cold climates long enough to develop longer limbs and larger bodies, the way modern peoples of northern latitudes still tend to. They were strong. The musculature implied by their bones, where we have their bones, is the musculature of people who lived in a hard world, walked great distances, hunted, climbed, fought, survived. And they were here, in Britain, in what is now Norfolk, walking across the muddy estuary of a great vanished river, about 900,000 years ago, in a small group, probably a family, probably hunting or gathering or moving from one camp to another. The footprints at Happisburgh tell us that at least 5 individuals were walking together. 3 of them were almost certainly children or very small adults. The footprints were measured carefully before the sea took them again, because the same tide that had uncovered them was also going to wash them away, and the scientists who came to study them had only a matter of days. They photographed every print from multiple angles. They made digital 3-dimensional models of the surface. They measured the depth, the length, the width, the angle of the toes. From all of this, they reconstructed what they could of the people who had made them. The tallest individual was probably about 170 centimeters in height. The smallest of the children was probably about 90 centimeters in height. They had walked in roughly the same direction, in a roughly southerly direction, across the soft estuary mud, near the high tide line of an ancient river. There was no sign that they had hurried. There was no sign that they had been chased. They had simply walked the way any family walks together along a beach, in the unknowable rhythms of an ordinary day, 900,000 years ago, on what would one day become the eastern coast of England. And then the tide had come in, and the mud had hardened around their footprints and been buried by another layer of mud, and another, and another, and then by the sands and the gravels of a different age, and then by the clays of yet another, and then eventually by the soil of more recent times, and then by the grass and the brambles of the modern Norfolk cliffs. And there those footprints had stayed, sealed away from light and air and erosion, for nearly 1,000,000 years, until that one storm in 2013 had taken the cliff face apart and laid them bare for a few brief days, before the next tide came and washed them away forever. The footprints exist now only in the photographs and the digital models. The real surface is gone. The sea took it back. The story now lives in the data and in the careful measurements and in the imaginations of everyone who has ever heard of it. The stone tools tell us a little more. At Happisburgh itself, and at the slightly earlier site of Pakefield, archaeologists have found small flint flakes, knapped with deliberate technique, struck off larger cores to produce sharp edges. These are not the great hand axes that we will meet later in this story. They are simpler tools, what archaeologists call the Mode 1 toolkit, or the Older One tradition, after the Olduvai Gorge in East Africa, where similar tools were first identified. The Mode 1 toolkit is very old. It goes all the way back, in Africa, to nearly 2.5 million years ago. Whoever first made it, in Africa, was probably one of the very early species of our genus, perhaps Homo habilis or someone close to that. The tradition then moved north, with the first hominin migrations out of Africa, and was carried across Eurasia by successive waves of toolmakers. By 900,000 years ago, when the people at Happisburgh were leaving their footprints and their flakes in the Norfolk mud, the Mode 1 toolkit had been around for about 1.5 million years. It was the basic, ancient, well-practiced technology of the human family. And the people who made it at Happisburgh were doing so on the very edge of the known hominin world, at the highest latitude any human being had yet managed to live at, in a climate that, at the time, was probably similar to that of modern Scandinavia. Cold winters, short days for half the year, snow sometimes on the ground, pine forests and birch forests, with broadleaf trees only in the warmer interglacial pulses. It was a hard place to live, in a hard time to live. And they did it anyway. How did they do it? That is one of the great questions of this whole story, and it is a question we will keep coming back to, because each successive species of person in Britain had to solve it again, in slightly different ways, with slightly different bodies and slightly different minds. The people at Happisburgh did not, as far as we know, have control of fire. The evidence for fire use that early is contested and thin. They did not have well-made clothing. The bone needles that allow for the sewing of fitted garments would not be invented for hundreds of thousands of years yet. They probably had simple wraps, animal skins draped over the body, perhaps tied with sinew, but nothing tailored, nothing close-fitting, nothing that would have kept out the worst of the northern wind in midwinter. They had no permanent houses, no settled villages, no agriculture, no domesticated animals, no pottery, no metals, no writing, no language as we would recognize it, although they almost certainly had some form of communication, some range of calls and gestures, and probably some primitive speech. They lived in small bands, probably no more than 20 or 30 individuals at a time, moving across the landscape with the seasons, following the herds, gathering the plants that ripened in summer, sheltering in caves or under overhangs or in lean, to structures of branches and skins when winter came. Their lives were short. Most of them probably did not live past 35. The children among them died often, of cold, of hunger, of disease, of predation. The adults among them died often, of injury, of illness, of childbirth, of old age that we would now consider middle age. And yet, they were here. They had walked here, all the way from Africa, or rather, their distant ancestors had, over the course of many generations, hundreds of thousands of years, across the Sinai, through the Levant, across Anatolia, across the Balkans, across the Central European plain, across the great rivers and the great mountains and the great forests, and finally, across the lowland marshes of Doggerland onto the northwestern peninsula of the continent that would one day be called Europe. They were the very tip of an enormous slow human expansion, the leading edge of a species in motion, the children of explorers who had been walking for so long that they did not even know they were exploring anymore. They were just people, living their lives on the edge of a world that had no edge yet, because no one had ever drawn the map. The footprints at Happisburgh are not the only evidence we have of these people. The flint tools at Happisburgh and Pakefield tell the same story, and so do older sites further south on the continent. At a place called Atapuerca, in the Sierra de Atapuerca in northern Spain, in a deep limestone cave system, archaeologists have spent more than 40 years carefully excavating the bones and the tools of the people whose distant cousins, perhaps, made the footprints at Happisburgh. The most famous of those caves is called Gran Dolina, and within Gran Dolina there is a layer of sediment, dated to between 780,000 and 1,000,000 years ago, that has produced the bones of several individuals of Homo antecessor. Some of them are children, some of them are adults. Some of them show signs of having been butchered, with cut marks on the bones in patterns that suggest the removal of flesh, the cracking open of long bones for marrow, the careful disarticulation of joints. This is possibly the oldest evidence of cannibalism in the human fossil record. The Homo antecessor people, in some places at least, ate each other. Whether this was ritual, or starvation, or warfare, or simply the practical disposal of the dead, we do not know. We may never know, but the bones, with their marks, lie in the museum cases at Burgos, and they speak, in their quiet way, of a life that was very different from anything we can really imagine. It is from those Spanish caves that we know what Homo antecessor looked like. They had, as I said, faces that were almost modern in some respects, with the beginnings of the cheekbone shape we see in living humans. They had heavy brow ridges. They had no real chin. Their teeth were larger than ours, but smaller than those of earlier hominins. Their brains were on average about 1,000 cubic centimeters in volume, with some variation. They were tall and powerfully built. They probably had skin the color of dark olive or brown, although we cannot know for certain, because the ancient DNA of Homo antecessor has not yet been recovered, and probably never will be from material this old, in this climate. They probably had dark eyes. They probably had dark hair. They probably looked, at a distance, like very tall and very heavy, set modern humans with rather strange and ancient faces, with low foreheads and heavy brows and powerful jaws. If you saw one walking towards you across a Norfolk beach in the dawn, you would know immediately that they were not one of us, but you would also know that they were a kind of person, that there was a mind looking out from behind those eyes, that the look they gave you, whatever it was the look of someone, not the look of an animal. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared in the European record, they disappeared. Homo antecessor vanishes from the fossil record after about 780,000 years ago. The evidence in Britain becomes very thin for a long time. There are flint tools from a site called Boxgrove in Sussex, dating to about 500,000 years ago. But the species who made them was by then no longer Homo antecessor. It was someone different, someone who would, in their turn, come to call this northern peninsula home for hundreds of thousands of years, before they too gave way to another, and another, in the long, slow drama of human species succession that has played out on this island for nearly 1,000,000 years. We will get to them in their turn. But first, we need to sit for a moment with the people of Happisburgh, the people of Pakefield, the people of the great vanished river estuary, the people who left their footprints in the mud and then walked on and were never seen again. They were here. They were our distant cousins, in the broadest possible sense. They were not us, but they were people, and they walked hand in hand with their children on the ground we now stand on, more than 30,000 human generations before any of us were born. The ground remembers them, in its way. The mud held their footprints for 1,000,000 years. The sea has taken those footprints back now, but the story is here. The story is in the data and the photographs and the careful, slow, patient work of all the people who have looked into the deep past and tried to see what was looking back. Sleep well, if you can. The night is still very young, and we have a long way still to go. The next people we meet on this island are not Homo antecessor. They are someone else. They arrive in the archaeological record at a place in West Sussex called Boxgrove, and the date is about 500,000 years ago. That is a gap of nearly 400,000 years between the footprints at Happisburgh and the next clear evidence of human life in Britain. 400,000 years is a very long time. It is longer than our own species has existed. It is longer than the entire span of recorded human history, multiplied by 60 or 70. And during all of that time, Britain was sometimes inhabited and sometimes not, in pulses and rhythms tied to the great climate cycles, the comings and goings of the ice. There were warm periods when the sea was high and the land was green and people could live there. There were cold periods when the ice came down and the people retreated south and Britain was simply empty for tens of thousands of years at a stretch, with the wind blowing across the tundra and no human eye to see it. The succession of species on this island, the long, slow drama we are walking through tonight, is not a continuous story. It is a story of arrivals and departures and arrivals again. People came north when the weather allowed. They were pushed south when the weather worsened. And each time the warm phases returned and the people came back. The people who came back were slightly different from the people who had left. The species itself was evolving on the continent. The bodies were changing. The brains were growing. The tools were getting better. And by the time the people came back to Britain, in any number, around 500,000 years ago, they were no longer Homo antecessor. They were Homo heidelbergensis. The next species in our long quiet procession, Boxgrove, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in Europe. It does not look like much today. It is a quarry, mostly, on the southern slope of the South Downs, where chalky gravels have been dug out for road building and concrete production for many decades. But within those gravels, in a particular layer that was once the muddy edge of a small ancient lake at the base of an old sea cliff, archaeologists found something almost unbelievable. They found the place where, 500,000 years ago, a group of Homo heidelbergensis people had butchered a horse. They had butchered other animals too, at the same lakeshore site, over what was probably a period of years or decades or even centuries. They had butchered red deer and giant deer and rhinoceros and a kind of large extinct bear and aurochs and others. But the most famous of the finds at Boxgrove is the butchered horse, because the layer of mud and silt that the butchery had taken place on was so finely preserved, so quickly covered over by the next deposits of the lake, so undisturbed by later activity, that you can see, in the archaeological record, exactly what happened. You can see where each flint flake fell from the toolmaker's hand. You can see the cluster of debris where one person sat, napping a new edge onto a hand axe before continuing to work. You can see the imprint, almost, of where the dead horse had lain on the ground while the people worked over it. You can see the order in which things happened. Hand axes were brought to the site already made. They were resharpened on the spot, producing a halo of small flakes around the position where the person was working. Then the meat was cut from the bone. Then the long bones were cracked open for marrow. Then the people left. And then the mud closed over what they had left behind. And it stayed closed for 500,000 years, until the quarry workers cut into it, and the archaeologists came running. What kind of people were these? They were taller, on average, than Homo antecessor. They were taller, in fact, than most modern Europeans. The skeletal evidence we have from Boxgrove itself is limited. Just a single tibia, a single shin bone, and 2 front teeth from a different individual. But the tibia is robust and long, and it suggests a man, almost certainly a man, of somewhere between 175 and 180 centimeters in height, with very heavy muscle attachments, with extremely thick bone walls, with leg bones that were carrying probably between 80 and 100 kilograms of body weight. He was, in other words, a tall, powerful man, the size and shape of a modern professional rugby player, but with the bone structure of someone who walked 30 or 40 kilometers a day and chased down large prey by sheer endurance, by hour after hour of relentless pursuit across the cold, open landscape of 500,000 years ago. His teeth show wear patterns that suggest meat was a major part of his diet, and that he used his front teeth as a kind of third hand, gripping things between them while he worked with his hands, the way some hunter-gatherer peoples still do today. He was not us. His brain, the brain of an average Homo heidelbergensis, was about 1,200 cubic centimeters in volume, larger than Homo antecessor by quite a margin, getting close to the modern human range, but still smaller than ours on average. His face was massive. Heavy brow ridges, an enormous wide nose, a powerful projecting jaw, no real chin. His forehead was low and sloping. The whole head was longer from front to back than ours, and slightly flatter on top. If you saw him walking towards you across that ancient Sussex lakeshore, you would know, again, immediately, that he was not a modern man. But you would also know, again, immediately, that he was a person. The eyes that looked at you would be the eyes of someone who knew how to make a hand axe, how to bring down a horse, how to teach a child, how to survive a winter in Northern Europe, with no clothes more advanced than draped animal skins, and no shelter more advanced than a windbreak of branches. The hand axes themselves deserve some attention here. They are one of the great signature artifacts of the entire deep human past. The technical name for them is the Aeolian tradition, after a place in France called Saint-Acheul, where they were first identified in the 19th century. Aeolian hand axes appear in Africa around 1¾ million years ago, and they spread out of Africa with the migrations of Homo erectus and Homo heidelbergensis. They are large, generally between 15 and 25 centimeters in length, shaped like a teardrop or an almond or a flat pear. They are made by taking a large flint nodule and striking flakes off both sides, alternately in a process called bifacial flaking, until the entire core has been reduced to a flattened symmetrical shape with sharp edges all the way around. The work of making a really good hand axe is the work of probably 2 or 3 hours in the hands of an experienced toolmaker. It requires extraordinary spatial reasoning, a clear mental image of the finished shape held in the mind throughout the entire process, an understanding of how flint will fracture when struck from different angles. It is not the work of a primitive mind. Whoever was making these things was thinking carefully, and with foresight, and with the kind of patience that only beings with developed cognition possess. The hand axes at Boxgrove are some of the most beautifully made hand axes in the entire archaeological record. They are symmetrical, well finished, sharp-edged, sometimes made of unusual flints carried from a distance, sometimes with a slight twist along the long axis that suggests aesthetic choice rather than purely functional design. Some of them, when held up to the light, are almost translucent at the edges. Some of them are made on cores that were almost too small for the task, suggesting that the maker was deliberately taking on a challenge, displaying skill. We do not know whether the hand axes at Boxgrove were practical tools or status objects, or both at once. We do not know whether they were made by every individual in the group, or by specialists, or by men only, or by women only, or by both. We have inferences and arguments, but no certainties. What we do know is that they were made, in large numbers, by people who were extremely good at making them, and that they were used for serious work, and that they were sometimes carried for long distances, and that they were left behind, in their thousands, across the landscape of southern England, wherever Homo heidelbergensis lived and hunted. Boxgrove gives us something else, beyond the hand axes and the tibia and the teeth. It gives us a snapshot of life. Because the lakeshore site was so fine-grained, so quickly buried, so undisturbed, the archaeologists were able to reconstruct in unusual detail what was actually happening at that place on those particular days 500,000 years ago. There is one site, in particular, where the butchery of a single horse can be followed, almost step by step, through the surrounding debris. A team of people, probably 4 or 5 of them, surrounded the dead horse, which was lying on its side at the edge of the lake. One of the people sat down a little way off, with a partly made or partly used hand axe, and resharpened it. The flakes that fell from the resharpening lie in a small cluster on the ground, exactly where they fell. He, or she, then handed the freshened hand axe to someone closer to the carcass, who used it to cut through the thick hide of the horse. The cut marks on the bones still show the angle and the pressure of those cuts. Another person, working at the head end, separated the lower jaw from the skull. Another, working at the rear end, removed the legs at the hip joints. The long bones were dragged a little way off and broken open with stones to extract the marrow inside. The brain case of the horse was cracked open and the brain removed. The bones that were not useful were left scattered around the carcass. The skin, the meat, the marrow, the brain, the organs were carried away. The people left. The lake mud closed over what they had left behind, and 500,000 years later, 3 British archaeologists, lying flat on their stomachs on a quarry floor with brushes and dental picks, painstakingly uncovered the entire scene, exactly as it had been left. What was happening to the horse before it died is also part of the story. The horse, when it was butchered, was a healthy young adult animal, in good condition, with no sign of disease. It had been killed by Homo heidelbergensis, not scavenged from a natural death. We know this because of the cut marks on the shoulder blade. One of the shoulder blades has a small round hole through it, on the upper edge, just above the joint. The hole is perfectly the right shape and the right angle to have been made by a wooden spear, driven in from above into the chest cavity from the side. This is one of the earliest pieces of direct evidence we have for hunting with spears anywhere in the human record. The spear itself does not survive, of course, because wood does not survive 500,000 years in most conditions. But we have one wooden spear from a contemporary site at a place called Schöningen in Germany, where archaeologists have found a set of beautifully made wooden javelins, carefully balanced, sharpened to a point at one end, dating from almost exactly the same period. These are the oldest known weapons in the human record. They were used to hunt horses, and the horse at Boxgrove was, almost certainly, killed with a spear of exactly that kind, by a hunter of Homo heidelbergensis. In the cold morning light at the edge of a lake, in what we now call Sussex, on a day 500,000 years ago, in a story that ended for the horse and continued for the hunter, and continues now for us as we look back through the layers of mud at what remains of that day. The hunters at Boxgrove did not have it all their own way. There were other predators on the landscape, and large ones. There were spotted hyenas, and lions, and large bears, and at least one species of saber-toothed cat in some of the warmer periods. We know from the bones, at Boxgrove and at related sites, that the human hunters were sometimes the scavenged, rather than the scavengers. There are hand axes at Boxgrove with hyena tooth marks on them, as if a hyena had picked up a discarded tool and chewed it idly. There are human bones at related sites with carnivore tooth marks on them, suggesting that some Homo heidelbergensis individuals ended their lives as food for the great cats and the great hyenas of the deep past. They were not the apex predators of their world. They were among the predators, but not unchallenged. And yet they survived. They survived in Britain for hundreds of thousands of years. They came and went with the climate cycles, returning every time the ice retreated, hunting their horses and their deer and their rhinoceroses, making their hand axes, raising their children, burying their dead or leaving their dead unburied. We do not really know. They survived long enough on this island that their bodies began to change, very slowly in response to the climate, and the changes that began at Boxgrove and similar sites would, over several 100,000 more years, lead to the next species we will meet. Because Homo heidelbergensis was not a static species. It was a species in motion, and in the cold north of Europe, in the long winters and the brutal ice ages, Homo heidelbergensis was very slowly becoming something else. Something cold adapted, something thick, boned and short-limbed, something that we, in our modern arrogance, would later give a name that has become almost a kind of insult, though it should never have been. We will meet them next, the Neanderthals, the most famous of all the ancient peoples of Europe, the people who came before us and lived alongside us, and finally, mysteriously, vanished from the face of the earth around 40,000 years ago, leaving no living descendants except for the small fragments of their DNA that still live on, even now, in your body and mine, in the cells of every person on Earth whose ancestors ever left Africa. But before we get to them, let us sit a little longer with the people of Boxgrove. Let us imagine the lakeshore, that morning, the cold autumn morning when the horse was killed. The mist on the water, the smell of the carcass, the soft sound of flint on flint as someone sat resharpening a hand axe in the long grass. The quiet voices of people speaking to one another in a language no one has spoken in 500,000 years. The breath of the children, watching from a few paces back. The look of the man with the spear, still standing over the dead horse, breathing hard. All of that is gone now. All of it has been gone for 500,000 years. But the mud remembers. The mud remembered for 500,000 years. And the mud told us, when we asked, "Sleep well, if you can." The night goes on. We have many more people still to meet. Before we leave Boxgrove and move on, it is worth saying one more thing about the kind of mind we are talking about. The making of a hand axe is, in some ways, a more cognitively complex task than the making of many of the tools used by modern hunter-gatherer peoples. It requires forward planning of a kind that very few animals can manage. The toolmaker has to imagine the final shape of the tool before they begin striking the core. They have to choose the right starting nodule, of the right size and the right grain and the right freedom from internal flaws. They have to remove flakes in a particular order, alternating from one face to the other, so that each strike sets up the next one. They have to recover from mistakes when a strike goes wrong, or when an internal flaw causes the core to break in an unexpected way. They have to know when to stop. They have to know the difference between a finished tool and one that needs more work. All of this implies a kind of mental simulation, a kind of inner imagination, a kind of holding of multiple possibilities in mind at once, that is extraordinarily rare in the animal world. The chimpanzees, who are our closest living relatives, can make simple tools, breaking sticks to fish for termites, choosing the right stones to crack open nuts. But the chimpanzees cannot make a hand axe. No chimpanzee, in any laboratory, with any amount of training, has ever made a hand axe, or anything close to a hand axe. The hand axe is a kind of tool that requires a kind of mind that only the genus Homo has ever possessed. And Homo heidelbergensis was making them, by the tens of thousands, across Europe and Africa and the Near East, for hundreds of thousands of years. They were, in a real sense, the great hand axe makers of the deep past. They were a successful species, with a successful technology, and they kept making it, with very little modification, for more time than our entire species has existed. They probably had language of some kind. The argument for this is partly anatomical and partly behavioral. Anatomically, the hyoid bone, the small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that supports the tongue and is involved in the production of complex speech sounds, has been found in the closely related Spanish site at the Cima de los Huesos in Atapuerca, and it is shaped very much like the hyoid of a modern human, with full capacity for the same range of vocalizations. The basicranium, the underside of the skull, is also shaped in a way that suggests a vocal tract capable of producing the full range of human speech sounds. Behaviorally, the level of coordination required for group hunting, the teaching of complex tool-making techniques across generations, the apparent transport of materials over long distances, all suggest the kind of social coordination that is very difficult to achieve without language. So the people at Boxgrove probably talked, whether they had grammar in the modern sense, whether their language had recursive embedded clauses, whether they had words for abstract concepts like tomorrow, or sorrow, or beautiful, we do not know. But they were probably talking to one another, in some way, as they butchered that horse. They were probably calling instructions to one another, naming the body parts, asking for tools, telling jokes, perhaps in the easy, familiar way that hunters have always talked while working over a kill. The voices are gone, the language is gone, but the talking was almost certainly there. The thing that strikes you, when you spend long enough thinking about these people, is how very long ago they lived, and at the same time, how very close they feel. 500,000 years is a number that the human mind cannot really grasp. It is more than 70 times the entire length of recorded human history. If you tried to imagine the generations stacked up between you and the man at Boxgrove with his spear, you would need about 20,000 of them. Parent to child, parent to child, parent to child, in an unbroken chain reaching back into the cold mist of the deep past. And yet, when you look at the butchered horse and the hand axes scattered around it, and the carefully resharpened tool, and the cluster of flakes where someone sat working, you feel something very familiar. The same kind of work being done, in the same kind of way, by people doing what people have always done. Hunting, feeding their families, teaching their craft, sitting together at the end of the day. They are very close to us in some ways. They are very far from us in others. They were not us, but they were ours in the broadest sense of that word. They were people, and they were here on this same ground 500,000 years ago, in the cold autumn morning, watching the mist rise off the lake. About 100,000 years after the people of Boxgrove were butchering their horses, the bodies of the people on this island began to change in noticeable ways. The first clear evidence of this comes from a place called Swanscombe, in Kent, in what is now the gravel terraces of the Lower Thames. The Swanscombe site is one of the oldest hominin fossil sites in northern Europe. It is famous because it has produced, over the course of nearly 70 years of excavation, 3 pieces of the same skull, found by 3 different people, in 3 different years, in 3 different parts of the same gravel pit, all of them eventually fitting together to form a partial cranium of a single individual who lived about 400,000 years ago. The first piece was found in 1935 by a man called Alvan Marston, who was a dentist by profession, but a passionate amateur archaeologist by avocation. He found the back of the skull, the occipital bone. The second piece, fitting onto the first, was found by Marston himself in 1936, about 8 meters away from where the first piece had been found, in a different layer of the same gravel sequence. The third piece, the left parietal, was found in 1955 by a different amateur archaeologist named John Weimer, working with a researcher called Bertram Cooper. The 3 pieces, when fitted together, formed almost the entire back half of the cranium of what is now known as the Swanscombe woman. We call her a woman because the cranial features, particularly the smoothness of the brow region and the overall gracility of the bone structure, are consistent with female anatomy. Although, as always with these very ancient remains, the diagnosis is not absolutely certain. She was probably in her early 20s when she died. The cause of her death is unknown. Her skull ended up in the gravels of the Thames, perhaps washed there by the river after her body was scavenged or simply left exposed, perhaps deliberately placed there for reasons we cannot now reconstruct. What is striking about the Swanscombe woman is that her skull is different from the skulls of the Boxgrove people. The brain case is larger, with an estimated cranial capacity of about 1,250 cubic centimeters, which is well within the modern human range, though on the smaller side of it. The bones at the back of the head are thicker than in modern humans, with a distinct ridge running across the back of the skull, what anatomists call a suprainiac fossa, a kind of small depression just above the bony projection at the back of the head, which is one of the diagnostic features of the Neanderthal lineage. The Swanscombe woman, in other words, was beginning to look like a Neanderthal. Not entirely. She had not yet acquired the full set of Neanderthal features that would develop over the next 200,000 years. But the trend was there. She was on the road. She was, in the technical language of the paleontologists, an early member of the Neanderthal evolutionary lineage, sometimes called pre-Neanderthal, sometimes called late Homo heidelbergensis with Neanderthal affinities, sometimes simply called Homo neanderthalensis at an early stage. The exact taxonomic terminology is disputed and will probably continue to be disputed, but what is clear is that the people on this island, 400,000 years ago, were no longer the same people who had been on this island 500,000 years ago. The species was changing. The bodies were adapting to the cold. The brains were growing. The faces were becoming larger and more projecting. The bones were getting thicker. The whole organism was shifting, in the slow tides of evolution, towards what we would eventually call the Neanderthals. Around the Swanscombe skull, in the same gravel layers, were thousands of hand axes. The hand axes from Swanscombe are similar to those from Boxgrove, but they are not identical. There are subtle changes in the technique, in the proportions, in the way the flakes are removed. The general Acheulean tradition continues, but it is evolving. The people who made these hand axes were beginning, very slowly, to do new things with their tool making. They were beginning to use a technique called levallois preparation, where a flint core is carefully shaped before the main flake is struck off, in such a way that the main flake comes off in a predetermined shape, large and flat and useful, like a knife blade, ready to be hafted onto a wooden handle. The Levallois technique is one of the great innovations of the deep human past. It allows the toolmaker to produce, in advance, the kind of flake they want, rather than having to use whatever the core happens to give them. It is a more abstract, more planned, more cognitively demanding technique than the older one, and it begins to appear in the European archaeological record around 300,000 years ago, sometimes earlier in the toolkits of the people who were becoming the Neanderthals. The Swanscombe woman and her people were on the edge of this transition. They were the bridge generation. They were the last of the great hand axe people and the first of the prepared core people. They were, in their bodies and in their minds, becoming someone new. The world they lived in, 400,000 years ago, was a slightly different world from the world of Boxgrove. The climate had moved through several glacial cycles since then. There had been a particularly cold ice age between Boxgrove and Swanscombe, the one geologists call the Anglian glaciation, when much of northern Britain was buried under ice and most of the island was uninhabitable. The Swanscombe woman lived in the warm interglacial that followed, sometimes called the Hoxnean interglacial, when the climate was as warm as today, or even slightly warmer, when oak forests covered much of southern England, when the rivers ran full and clear, when the animals of the lower Thames included elephants and rhinoceroses and lions and giant deer and many smaller things. It was a green world, a fat world, a world that could support quite a lot of people, if the people knew how to live in it. And the people, by then, did know. They had been learning for hundreds of thousands of years. They had developed the toolkit, refined the hunting techniques, learned the seasons, mapped the rivers, named the places, in whatever language they spoke. They were sophisticated foragers of a kind that would have been almost unthinkable to the first arrivals at Happisburgh 500,000 years before. They were good at being where they were. We have one other extraordinary piece of evidence from this time period, not from Britain itself, but from just across the Channel, in northern Germany, at a site called Bildungsleben. Bildungsleben is contemporary with Swanscombe, dating to between 370 and 400,000 years ago, and it is the site of what appears to be a hunting camp or living site of the same kind of people who made the Swanscombe woman. The site preserves not only stone tools and bones, but also, remarkably, evidence of structures. There are pavements of stones and bones, laid out in deliberate patterns, that appear to be the foundations or floors of huts. There are concentrated areas of charcoal and burned bone, the remains of hearths, suggesting controlled use of fire. There are bones with deliberate carvings on them, including a piece of elephant bone with parallel scratch marks that appear to be intentional. Perhaps the earliest known example of deliberate symbolic mark-making in the human record. These people were not just tool makers. They were builders. They were makers of fire. They were perhaps makers of art, or of the kind of marks that one day would become art. They were doing things that no animal does. They were doing things that even today define what it means to be a human being, in the broadest sense of that word. And they were doing them 400,000 years ago, in a clearing by a small lake in central Germany, while their cousins were chipping out the same kinds of hand axes on the gravel banks of the Thames. It is worth pausing here to think about what fire meant. The control of fire is one of the great deep transitions in human evolution. The exact date when our ancestors first controlled fire is hotly debated. Some researchers point to evidence from 1.5 million years ago, from sites in East Africa. Others argue that the evidence becomes really compelling only around 400,000 years ago, with sites like Biltingsleben in Europe and a place called Beech's Pit in England, which is also Hoxnean in age and which has produced some of the best evidence we have for fire use in early Britain. Beech's Pit is in Suffolk, in eastern England, and it is a small site, just a few square meters of preserved sediments, but those sediments contain something extraordinary. They contain hand axes that have been heated, then cooled, then heated again, in patterns that suggest the hand axes were being made or worked near a hearth. They contain reddened sediments, suggesting the prolonged presence of fire. They contain bits of charcoal, fragments of burned bone, and the patterned remains of what appears to be a small campfire or hearth used repeatedly over time. This is, if the interpretation is correct, some of the oldest evidence of fire use in Britain, and it dates from about the same time as the Swanscombe woman. The people of her time, in other words, had fire. They could keep themselves warm at night. They could cook their food, breaking down the tough fibers of meat and making more calories available, allowing the brain to grow larger and the body to require less raw food intake. They could keep the predators away from the camp at night. They could see one another in the dark. They could sit together around the flames and look at each other and pass the long evenings in whatever way people passed long evenings 400,000 years ago. The change that fire brought to human life is impossible to overstate. It changed almost everything. And by the time of the Swanscombe woman, the change was well underway. Sometime after Swanscombe, the climate worsened again, and Britain was depopulated for a long time. The next great interglacial, the one geologists call the Ipswichian, was a warm phase that ran from about 130,000 years ago to about 115,000 years ago. The interesting thing about the Ipswichian is that, despite the warmth and the abundance of game, there is almost no evidence of any human presence in Britain during it. The hippopotamuses were here. The straight-tusked elephants were here. The lions and the spotted hyenas were here. But the people, apparently, were not. The Ipswichian Britain may have been completely uninhabited by hominins of any kind, for reasons we do not entirely understand. Perhaps the people who would have lived in it could not cross the rising sea levels that flooded the southern lowlands. Perhaps the populations on the continent were too small or too distant to send pioneers north. Perhaps something else was going on that we cannot now reconstruct. Whatever the cause, the Ipswichian seems to have been a Britain without humans, a long, warm, green, silent island in which the hippos wallowed in the Thames at what is now Trafalgar Square, and the elephants browsed in the forests of Kent, and not a single human being walked anywhere on the land for tens of thousands of years. And then, as the climate began to cool again, and the Ipswichian gave way to the next phase of glaciation, the people came back. The people who came back were the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals, even the name is famous. They were given that name in the 19th century, after the first skeleton clearly recognized as belonging to their kind was found in 1856 in a small limestone cave in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf in Germany. The valley is called the Neanderthal in German, and Tal is the German word for valley, so the people from that valley became, in the language of science, the Neanderthals, or in the Latinized form, the Neanderthalensis. The first scientists who studied the original skeleton thought at first that they were looking at the remains of a Cossack soldier from the Napoleonic Wars who had crawled into a cave to die, or possibly the remains of a man with severe rickets, or possibly the remains of someone with some other kind of bone disease. The skeleton was so different from anything they had seen before that they could not, at first, accept that it represented a different kind of human being. It took decades of further finds in caves all across Europe and into Western Asia. before the scientific consensus came round to the idea that these were the remains of a separate species or subspecies, a different kind of person, who had lived in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years and had then gone extinct. The picture we have of the Neanderthals now is very different from the picture our great-great-grandparents would have had. In the early 20th century, the Neanderthals were imagined as the brutish caveman of popular imagination, the hairy, stooping savage of countless cartoons and bad films, swinging a club, dragging a woman by the hair, communicating in grunts. None of this is accurate. The original mistake came from a single skeleton, found at a place called La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France in 1908, which was reconstructed in a deeply hunched and bent posture by a French paleontologist called Marcelin Boule, who was working from a Neanderthal who was, in fact, an elderly individual with severe osteoarthritis. The misreconstruction set the stereotype for a century. We now know that healthy Neanderthals walked fully upright, with the same posture as modern humans, and that their gait and their bearing would have been entirely normal to modern eyes. They were not stooping. They were not hairy in any obvious way, more than modern humans, although their precise body hair distribution is not knowable. They were not stupid. Their brains, on average, were slightly larger than ours, between 14 and 1500 cubic centimeters in volume, compared to our average of about 1400. They were physically different from us in many ways. They were shorter and stockier than modern Europeans, with broader chests, more powerful shoulders, shorter limbs relative to body size, larger noses, heavier brow ridges, longer skulls. They were cold adapted. They had been living in glacial Europe for so long that their bodies had taken on the shape of a cold weather mammal, compact and heat-conserving, like the Inuit or the Sami, but more extreme. They were strong. The Neanderthal skeleton shows musculature attachments well beyond what modern humans display. A Neanderthal woman of average build could probably have out-wrestled a strong modern man. A Neanderthal man could probably have lifted things that no modern human could lift. They had been evolving in Europe slowly from the lineage we met at Swanscombe for about 300,000 years, and they had been refining their toolkit, their hunting techniques, their social organization, the entire time. By the time they came back into Britain, around 60,000 years ago, or perhaps a little earlier, they were a fully developed Neanderthal population. They were the most successful hominin species ever to live in Europe. They had survived multiple full ice ages. They had hunted the largest and most dangerous game in the world. They had developed, very probably, a complete spoken language, though we cannot know what it sounded like. They had developed the burial of their dead in some places, with grave goods placed beside the body. They had cared for their old and their sick, evidence of which we see in the skeletons of individuals who could not have survived without the support of others. They had begun to use ochre, the red mineral pigment, perhaps for body decoration, perhaps for symbolic purposes we cannot now reconstruct. They had begun to make string and cord, the oldest evidence of which comes from a Neanderthal site in France called Abri du Maras, where fragments of twisted plant fibers have been found, dating to about 45,000 years ago. They were, in short, fully and unambiguously human in everything that mattered. They were not us, but they were people. In Britain, the Neanderthals left traces in many places. The oldest clearly Neanderthal site on this island is a cave called Pont Newydd, in the Elwy Valley in North Wales, in the limestone country south of the Clwydian Range. Pont Newydd is a small cave, set high in a wooded hillside, and from the outside, it looks like nothing special. But inside, beneath layers of broken limestone and ancient mud, archaeologists have found the remains of at least 5 individuals, including teeth and jaw fragments and one piece of a small skull, dating from about 230,000 years ago, which is one of the earliest Neanderthal or pre-Neanderthal sites in Britain. The teeth from Pontnevid are clearly Neanderthal in their morphology. They have what is called taurodontism, an enlargement of the pulp chamber inside the tooth that is one of the distinctive features of the Neanderthal dental pattern. They have shovel-shaped incisors where the inner surface of the front teeth has raised ridges on either side, giving the tooth a kind of scoop shape. They were the teeth of children, mostly, perhaps 8 or 9 years old at death. Several of them. Why were so many children buried or left in this single cave? We do not know. We do not know whether they died of disease, of starvation, of cold, of conflict, of accident. We do not know whether the bodies were placed there deliberately or whether they were simply where they happened to die. The cave was a habitation site, that much is clear. There are stone tools all around the bones. There are bones of animals, butchered for food. There are signs of fire, of hearths, of long-term human use of the space. The children, whoever they were not strangers to this place. They lived here, with their families, and they died here, and they are still here, in the limestone of North Wales, 230,000 years later, with their teeth still in their jaws. The toolkit at Pontnevid is in some ways more advanced than what we saw at Swanscombe. The Levallois technique is fully developed by this point. There are prepared cores from which large standardized flakes have been struck. There are flakes turned into side scrapers, into points, into knives. There are hand axes still, but they are smaller and finer than the great Acheulean hand axes of Boxgrove. The whole toolkit reflects a refinement and a sophistication that has been 100,000 years in the making since Swanscombe. The people who made these tools were the people we now properly call Neanderthals. The transition from late Homo heidelbergensis to true Neanderthal was, by this point, complete. And the Neanderthals of Pontnevid would be the ancestors, in a broad sense, of the Neanderthals who would inhabit Britain off and on for the next 200,000 years, coming and going with the climate, retreating south when the ice advanced, returning north when the ice withdrew, in a long, slow rhythm that would continue right up until the moment our own species arrived and changed everything. Let me take you, for a moment, to one of the most extraordinary Neanderthal sites ever found in Britain. It is in Norfolk, in the small village of Limford, near the River Wissey, in the flat eastern country of Fenland and Field. In 1999, in the course of routine quarry work for the extraction of sand and gravel, workers came across some unusual bones in a particular layer of sediment, and an archaeologist was called in to investigate. What he found over the next several years of excavation was a complete Neanderthal hunting site, dating from about 60,000 years ago, in which a small group of Neanderthals had killed and butchered at least 9 adult woolly mammoths. The site was a kind of natural ambush point at the edge of a small stream, where the mammoths had been driven into the marshy ground and become bogged down, and then killed, probably with spears, and butchered on the spot. The bones of the mammoths were still there, in a kind of disordered jumble in the soft sediments, exactly where they had fallen. Around the bones, scattered across the area, were nearly 50 Neanderthal hand axes, beautifully made, mostly of black flint, imported from somewhere else, possibly from the chalk downs to the south. There were dozens of other stone tools. There were the bones of other animals that had also been killed there, including reindeer and woolly rhinoceros and bison and horse. There were the broken pieces of mammoth long bones, cracked open for marrow, the marks of the cutting tools still visible on the surfaces. It was a working site, a slaughter site, a place where Neanderthals had come, again and again over what was probably a period of weeks or months or possibly years, to take advantage of a natural feature of the landscape that funneled large animals into a place where they could be killed. What makes Limford so striking is the size of the prey. Woolly mammoths were not small animals. A full-grown adult woolly mammoth could weigh 6 or 7 tons, stand 3.5 meters at the shoulder, have tusks 4 meters long, and was perfectly capable of killing a human being with a single sweep of its head. To kill one was a major undertaking. To kill 9 of them in the same place suggests organized cooperative hunting at a high level. The Neanderthals at Linford were not opportunists scavenging carcasses. They were active mammoth hunters, working as a team, using the landscape as a weapon, with planned strategies and shared techniques and the kind of coordination that takes years of practice to develop. They were, in their cold and shaggy way, formidable. The picture of the brutish, stupid caveman could not be further from the truth of what was happening at Linford. These were people who knew exactly what they were doing. They had probably been doing it for generations. The site, on present evidence, may have been used for the same purpose by the same group of people for a long time. They knew about it. They came back to it. They taught their children to come back to it. And the mammoth bones piled up in the marsh, and the hand axes piled up among the bones. And eventually, the climate worsened, or the herds moved, or the people died or moved on, and the site was abandoned, and the soft layers of the fen closed over it. And there it stayed until a sand quarry in the late 20th century laid it open to the light again. There is something almost unbearable, when you think about it, in the image of the hunters at Linford. We can picture them if we close our eyes. The thick winter light, the cold breath of a small group of Neanderthal men, and probably some women too, standing at the edge of the marsh with their spears, watching the bogged-down mammoth thrash and roar in the soft mud. They would have moved in carefully from upwind, where the great animal could not smell them. They would have driven their spears into its flanks, into the soft places under the forelegs, into the throat if they could reach it. The mammoth would have fought for a very long time before it died. It would have screamed in whatever way mammoths screamed, and the sound would have carried across the marsh and the surrounding forest. And the Neanderthals would have stood back and waited, and worked, and watched. And finally, after what was probably a very long time, the great beast would have stopped moving, and the hunters would have come forward with their hand axes ready and begun the long bloody work of butchery. They were strong people. They were patient people. They were dangerous people. And they were not us. The Neanderthals had been in Britain, off and on, for tens of thousands of years by the time of the Linford hunt. Through the long cold of the last full glaciation, they had retreated south into France and Iberia and the Mediterranean refuges, where the climate was milder and the game was more reliable. But every time the climate warmed even slightly, they pushed back north, into Britain again, hunting the cold steppe animals of the periglacial environment. We find their tools at sites all across southern and central Britain, at a place called Linford itself, in Norfolk, as we have just seen, at a place called Creswell Crags, on the border between Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire, where a series of limestone caves preserve thousands of years of Neanderthal occupation, at a place called Pickens Hole, in the Mendip Hills of Somerset, a tiny cave high on a hillside, where Neanderthal jaw fragments have been found dating to between 50 and 40,000 years ago, late in the Neanderthal story. At a place called Kent's Cavern, in Devon, where Neanderthal tools occur alongside, and below, the very earliest evidence of modern human presence in Britain. And at many other sites, mostly caves, mostly in the limestone country of the western and northern uplands, where the soft sediments inside the caves preserve traces that have long since been washed away from the open landscape outside. There is one Neanderthal site, not actually in Britain proper, but on the small island of Jersey in the English Channel, that deserves a special mention here because it is one of the most extraordinary Neanderthal sites anywhere in the world. The site is called La Cote de Saint-Breled, and it is a cave, or really a system of caves and ravines, cut into the granite cliffs of the southwestern coast of Jersey. It has been excavated, off and on, for more than 100 years, and it preserves a deep stratigraphic sequence of Neanderthal occupation going back hundreds of thousands of years. The most famous feature of La Cote is something that was found in the 1960s and 70s by a team led by an archaeologist called Charles McBurney, in two distinct layers of the site, separated by some thousands of years. There were deposits of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros bones, stacked in deliberate piles at the foot of what would have been, at the time, the edge of the cliff above. The bones included the skulls and the limb bones of at least 11 mammoths in one layer and at least 9 in another, along with bones of several woolly rhinoceroses. The interpretation that emerged, and that has been argued over ever since, is that the Neanderthals at La Cotte were driving these great animals over the cliff edge, deliberately, in a kind of mass kill technique that we know from later prehistoric peoples in many parts of the world. The animals would have been stampeded towards the cliff, panicked, perhaps with fire, or with noise, or with thrown stones, and would have plunged over the edge to their deaths on the rocks below, where the Neanderthals could then butcher them at leisure. Whether this interpretation is correct in every detail is still being debated, but the basic fact remains that an enormous quantity of large game animal bones, of just the kind one would expect from a mass kill site, are preserved in two distinct stratigraphic horizons at the foot of an ancient Neanderthal cliff. Whatever was happening there, it was happening on a large scale, with great cooperation, with great organization, with a long-term knowledge of the landscape, and the animals that goes far beyond the picture of the simple, opportunistic hunter. La Cotte also produced, over its long history of excavation, a small number of human teeth, including 13 teeth from a single individual found in 1910, all of them showing the diagnostic features of the Neanderthal dental pattern. These teeth, sometimes referred to as the Jersey teeth, were studied in recent years, using modern techniques, and one of the surprising results was that, while they are clearly Neanderthal in their basic morphology, they also show some features that hint at hybridization with modern humans, suggesting that the individual to whom these teeth belonged may have been the product, however many generations back, of interbreeding between Neanderthal and modern human populations. The teeth themselves date from around 48,000 years ago, which is right at the edge of the period when modern humans were arriving in Europe. So La Cotte may preserve, in those few small bits of fossilized enamel, and the last echoes of one of the most important moments in human history, the moment when two different kinds of person met and looked at each other, and sometimes fought each other, and sometimes made love to each other, and produced children whose own teeth carried, sealed inside the enamel, the genetic record of that meeting, because that, we now know, is what happened. The Neanderthals did not simply die out and leave no trace. They merged, in part, with the population of modern humans that swept into Europe from the south and east, starting around 45 or 50,000 years ago. The DNA evidence is unambiguous on this point. Every person alive today whose ancestors left Africa within the last 100,000 years carries a small fraction of Neanderthal DNA in their genome. The figure varies, but it averages around 1 to 2% for most modern Europeans and East Asians, with somewhat higher percentages in some populations and slightly lower in others. That 2% in your own body comes from somewhere. It comes from some moment, 40 or 50,000 years ago, when one of your distant ancestors, a modern human, met one of your other distant ancestors, a Neanderthal, and the meeting produced offspring, and those offspring grew up and had children of their own, and the genetic legacy of that ancient encounter has stayed with the human family ever since. 2% does not sound like much, but 2% of a human genome is 600 million base pairs of DNA. It is a vast amount of inherited information. It includes genes that affect the immune system, the skin, the hair, the metabolism, the propensity to certain diseases. It is still living. It is still doing things in your cells, right now, as you listen to this voice. The Neanderthals did not vanish entirely. They live on, in small pieces, in almost every modern person whose ancestry traces outside Africa. How exactly the encounter between Neanderthal and modern human went, We do not know in any detail. The genetic record tells us that the interbreeding was not unidirectional. It happened in both directions, with Neanderthal genes flowing into modern human populations and modern human genes flowing into Neanderthal populations, although the latter is harder to detect because the Neanderthal population eventually died out and most of its specific genetic contribution is lost. The genetic record also tells us that the interbreeding happened mostly during a window of a few thousand years, between about 50 and 40,000 years ago, in the region where the modern humans coming north out of Africa first encountered the Neanderthal populations of the Middle East and southern Europe. By the time modern humans reached Britain, they were already carrying a small but significant amount of Neanderthal DNA from those earlier encounters further south. The British Neanderthals themselves may or may not have contributed additional DNA to the incoming modern human population. We do not know. The genetic resolution of our current ancient DNA techniques is not yet quite fine enough to answer that question. But what is clear is that there was contact, and that there was overlap, and that there was exchange of one kind or another between the two kinds of person on the same landscape for at least some thousands of years before the Neanderthals finally disappeared. And then, somewhere between 45 and 35,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. The last Neanderthal bones we have in Europe come from sites in Spain and southern France and a few other refuges, dating to between 40 and 37,000 years ago, depending on the specific dating method used. In Britain, the picture is less clear, because the Neanderthal sites here are sparser and harder to date, but it seems likely that the last Neanderthals on this island were here until at least 40,000 years ago, possibly a little later, and that they overlapped with the first modern human arrivals for a few thousand years before finally vanishing from the landscape. We do not know why the Neanderthals went extinct. We have many theories. They may have been outcompeted by modern humans, who appear to have had slightly more efficient hunting techniques, slightly larger social networks, slightly better technology in some respects. They may have been particularly hard hit by climate fluctuations in the late phase of their existence, when the ice ages were swinging wildly back and forth and the populations were already small and fragmented. They may have been affected by diseases brought into Europe by the incoming modern humans, against which the Neanderthals had no immunity, in a tragic prefiguration of the kind of demographic collapse that we have seen repeatedly in historical times when previously isolated populations have come into contact. They may have simply been absorbed by interbreeding into the larger modern human population, with their distinct identity dissolving over a few generations into the general human gene pool of post-Neanderthal Europe. The most likely explanation is some combination of all of these factors. The Neanderthals were a small population, scattered across a vast and harsh environment, at the edge of their ecological tolerance, and when the world changed around them, in multiple ways at once, they did not have the demographic reserves to survive it. The species ended, the last Neanderthal died, and we do not know who that person was, or where they died, or whether they were buried, or whether their kin mourned them, or whether they died alone, or whether they were the last but did not know it. We do not know any of these things, but somewhere, sometime, in the cold caves of southern Europe, or perhaps right here in Britain, there was a final breath, taken by the last member of a kind of person that had lived on this continent for 300,000 years. And then there was silence. The people who took the Neanderthals' place are us, or at least the direct ancestors of us. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, our own species, walked into Britain for the first time around 44,000 years ago. We know this because of a fragment of a jawbone, a small piece of the lower jaw of a single individual, found in 1927 in Kent's Cavern, a limestone cave near Torquay in Devon. The jaw piece was excavated by an archaeologist called Arthur Ogilvie, and for a long time it was thought to be much younger than it is. The original excavators believed it to be from the later prehistoric period, perhaps Bronze Age. But in 2011, the jaw was redated using modern radiocarbon techniques on a tiny sample of its collagen, and the result was a date of around 44,200 years before the present, give or take a few hundred years. This made the Kent's Cavern jaw one of the oldest modern human fossils in northern Europe, and the very earliest evidence of modern human presence in Britain. The shape of the jaw, the shape of the teeth, the proportions, all indicate that this was a member of Homo sapiens, and not a Neanderthal. The arrival had happened. Our species was here, and from that small fragment of jawbone in that cave near Torquay, we can trace, with growing detail as the centuries pass, the spread of our own kind across the landscape of Britain, the first true ancestors of the modern British people, walking into a world that still belonged, in many places, to the Neanderthals. What did these first modern humans look like? They looked nothing like modern British people. This is one of the most striking and most surprising findings of the recent revolution in ancient DNA studies. The earliest modern humans in Europe, the people of 40,000 years ago, and 30,000 years ago, and 20,000 years ago, had skin that was, on average, much darker than the skin of modern Europeans. They had hair that was, on average, dark brown or black. They had eyes that were, on average, dark brown. The pale skin and the blue eyes and the blonde and red hair of the modern European populations are mostly the products of later evolution, with most of the genetic variants that produce these features only appearing in any frequency in the European gene pool within the last 10 or 12,000 years, and some of them only within the last 5 or 6,000 years. The earliest modern humans in Britain looked, in their basic colouring, much more like modern peoples of Africa, or of the Indian subcontinent, or of the Middle East, than like modern peoples of northwestern Europe. They had moved north, out of Africa, relatively recently, in evolutionary terms, and they had not yet had time to evolve the adaptations to low light and northern climates that would later characterize their descendants. They were tall, they were lean, they were dark-skinned, they were dark-haired, they had brown eyes, and they walked into a Britain that had, for the past 300,000 years, been inhabited by Neanderthals, and they took it from them, or shared it with them, for a few thousand years before the Neanderthals were gone. We have an extraordinary witness to this period, in the form of a man who lived in Britain about 10,000 years ago, long after the Neanderthals were gone, but who still preserved the basic genetic profile of those early modern human arrivals. His name, in modern English, is Cheddar Man. He was found in 1903 in a small chamber off the main entrance of Gough's Cave, a great limestone cavern in the village of Cheddar, in the Mendip Hills of Somerset, the same village that gave its name to one of the most famous cheeses in the world. Cheddar Man was discovered by workmen who were digging a drainage channel through the floor of the cave, and they came across a more or less complete human skeleton, lying in a shallow grave under the cave floor. The skeleton was that of a young man, in his early 20s, who had been buried, or at least placed, in this position deliberately. He had died, perhaps, of a violent blow to the head. There is a small fracture in his skull that may have been the cause of death. He had been laid down on his side in a flexed position, with his knees drawn up towards his chest, in a manner that suggests deliberate burial. His skeleton was kept in the Natural History Museum in London for many decades, and was studied repeatedly, and was the subject of much research and much speculation, until, in 2018, a team of researchers led by an ancient DNA specialist called Selina Brace managed to extract enough genetic material from a small sample of his inner ear bone, the petrous part of the temporal bone, which is the densest bone in the human body and the best preserver of ancient DNA, to sequence his entire genome. The results of that sequencing were widely reported, and they surprised many people, although they should not have. Cheddar Man, the oldest near-complete modern human skeleton from Britain, dating to about 10,000 years ago, had very dark skin. His skin was approximately the color, in modern terms, of what we would now describe as dark brown or black. He had dark curly hair. He had striking blue eyes, the result of a particular genetic variant that had begun to appear in European populations a few thousand years before his lifetime, and which appeared to have been very early in his genetic lineage. The combination of dark skin and blue eyes is unusual today, but it was very probably the standard combination for British people during the Mesolithic period, between about 10,000 and 6,000 years ago. The forensic reconstruction of Cheddarman's face, produced by the museum's research team using his skull and his genetic profile, was widely circulated when it was unveiled and provoked a great deal of public discussion. Many people had imagined the prehistoric Britons as looking, more or less, like the modern Britons. They had not. The modern look, the pale skin, the light eyes, the light hair, came later, much later, with the great population movements of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, when farming populations and then later metalworking populations swept into Britain from the European mainland and largely replaced, by both interbreeding and by simple demographic dominance, the earlier hunter-gatherer populations who had been here since the end of the Ice Age. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The Cheddarman story belongs to the very end of the long story we are telling tonight. He was a modern human 10,000 years ago, in a Britain that no longer had any other kinds of person in it. The Neanderthals had been gone for 30,000 years by his time. Between his death and the deaths of the last Neanderthals, an enormous amount had happened. The last great ice age had come and gone. The whole of northern Britain had been buried under ice and then uncovered again. The sea levels had risen and risen and risen, until what had been a land bridge to Europe across Doggerland had been first flooded and then submerged completely. The rising waters of the great melt drowning the prehistoric world of the southern North Sea and turning Britain, finally, into an island. The animals that the Neanderthals had hunted, the mammoths and the woolly rhinoceroses and the cave lions and the cave hyenas, had all gone extinct, or had withdrawn to the high latitudes where they too would eventually disappear. The forests had come back as the climate warmed, and the herds of deer and aurochs and wild boar had replaced the great cold steppe fauna. The world that Cheddarman knew was a world that the Neanderthals would have found unrecognizable. But before we get to him properly, we should sit with the very earliest modern human arrivals in Britain a little longer, because they are the people who actually replaced the Neanderthals, and their story is one of the most remarkable in the entire deep human past. Around 44,000 years ago, when the Kent's cavern jaw fragment was deposited in that cave in Devon, modern humans were spreading across Europe in what archaeologists call the Aurignacian, named after a French site called Aurignac, where the characteristic toolkit was first identified. The Aurignacian was a different kind of toolkit from anything the Neanderthals had made. It was based on the systematic production of long narrow blades of flint, struck from carefully prepared cores, in a technique that produced enormous numbers of efficient cutting edges from a relatively small amount of raw material. The Aurignacian toolmakers also made bone tools in much larger quantities than the Neanderthals had ever made. They made awls and points and needles, the first true sewing needles in the human record, with eyes drilled or carved through the upper end, allowing for the threading of sinew or plant fiber and the production of fitted clothing for the first time in human history. The fitted clothing was, very probably, one of the keys to the modern human success in northern environments. The Neanderthals had had clothing too, in some form, but it had probably been simple draped wraps of animal hide tied with cord. The modern humans, with their bone needles and their sinew thread, could make fitted garments that hugged the body, kept in the heat, allowed for vigorous movement without exposure of the skin. They could survive the cold better than the Neanderthals could, despite having less cold-adapted bodies. They could move further, they could hunt longer, they could live in places that the Neanderthals could not. And they made art. This is perhaps the most striking single difference between the modern humans of the Aurignacian and all the people who had come before. The Neanderthals had made some symbolic objects, certainly. They had used ochre, perhaps for body decoration. They had collected unusual stones and shells. They had, in a few cases, scratched patterns on bone or stone that might be deliberate symbols. But the modern humans, from almost the moment they enter the European archaeological record, are making art in quantity, of high quality, with clear aesthetic and symbolic intent. They are making small carved figurines of mammoth ivory and bone and stone, including the famous figurines of women known as the Venus figurines, with exaggerated reproductive features found across Europe from France to Russia. They are making cave paintings, the great galleries of animal images that decorate the limestone caves of southern France and northern Spain, painted on walls and ceilings deep in the dark interiors of caves, requiring lamps and ladders and careful planning to produce. They are making musical instruments, including bone flutes with finger holes, several of which have been found in caves in southern Germany, dating to around 40,000 years ago. They are making personal ornaments in quantity, pierced shells and animal teeth strung as necklaces, ivory beads carved with extraordinary precision, sometimes drilled with such small-bore holes that experimental archaeologists struggle to reproduce them with replica tools. The modern humans of the Aurignacian, in short, are recognizably us, in everything that we now think of as making us human, in every dimension of culture and symbol and aesthetic that we now take for granted. They are the first humans we can look back at and feel, immediately, that we recognize them as our own kind in the fullest sense of the word. They are not different. They are us, at the very beginning of us. In Britain, the earliest modern human sites are not as rich as the great sites on the continent, partly because so much of the prehistoric land surface has been destroyed by later glaciations and by sea level rise, and partly because the modern human populations in Britain seem to have been small and intermittent for the first several thousand years after their arrival. The Aurignacian in Britain is represented by a small number of sites, mostly caves in the southwestern and northern uplands, and by small scatters of the characteristic long blades and bone tools. At Kent's Cavern, where the famous jaw fragment was found, there are Aurignacian-style tools alongside the human bone. At a place called Hyena Den, in Wookey Hole in Somerset, there is a small assemblage of similar material, mixed in with the bones of the spotted hyenas that gave the site its name. At Goat's Hole in Paveland, on the Gower Peninsula in South Wales, there is one of the most extraordinary single finds from this entire period, the so-called Red Lady of Paveland, who is in fact a young man, who was buried in a cave overlooking the Bristol Channel, with his body sprinkled in red ochre, and with grave goods, including periwinkle shells and ivory rods, and who has been radiocarbon dated to about 33,000 years ago, in the very depth of the last ice age. The Red Lady of Paveland is the oldest formerly buried human in Britain. He is one of the oldest formerly buried modern humans anywhere in Western Europe. He was found in 1823 by the pioneering geologist William Buckland, who, working before the science of radiocarbon dating existed, and before the antiquity of humans was generally accepted, identified the skeleton as a Roman-era prostitute, hence the name, which has stuck despite being entirely wrong in every detail. He was not a woman, he was a man. He was not Roman, he was Aurignacian. He lived in Britain at the very edge of the last ice age, in a cave overlooking what is now the sea, but what was then a vast open plain stretching south towards the distant glaciers of Central Europe. After the Red Lady of Paveland, the modern human population of Britain seems to have largely withdrawn. The last great ice age, the one geologists call the last glacial maximum, came in around 26,000 years ago and lasted until about 19,000 years ago. And during that period, Britain seems to have been once again completely uninhabited by people. The ice came down, the sea levels dropped, exposing the plains of Doggerland once again as a vast open tundra. The people who had been in Britain retreated south to the refugia of southern France and northern Spain and the Italian peninsula, where the climate, while still cold, was just survivable. The British landscape became, for a few thousand years, a frozen polar wilderness, with the great ice sheets covering everything north of a line running roughly from Bristol to the Wash, and with permafrost and tundra covering everything south of that. The animals that lived there were the cold steppe animals, the mammoths and the woolly rhinoceroses and the cave lions, but in dwindling numbers, and there were no people at all. The silence returned, the land waited. When the climate began to warm again, around 15,000 years ago, the modern humans came back, in what archaeologists call the Magdalenian, after a French site called La Madeleine. The Magdalenian toolkit is even more refined than the Aurignacian, with extraordinary fine work in bone and antler, with elaborate personal ornaments, with the most spectacular cave paintings of the entire Ice Age period, including the great galleries at Lascaux and Altamira. In Britain, the Magdalenian is represented by a small but increasing number of sites, including the famous cave sites at Creswell Crags on the Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire border, where the only certain Ice Age cave art in the British Isles has been found. The Creswell art was discovered in 2003 by a team of researchers who had heard rumours of older markings on the cave walls and went looking for them with the right lighting and the right expectations. They found engravings of bison and ibex and red deer and the figure of what might be a bird, scratched into the limestone of the cave walls, dating to around 13 or 14,000 years ago. These are not the great painted galleries of southern France, but they are real Ice Age art made by the descendants of the people who painted those galleries. In a cave in the English Midlands, at the very edge of the world, they had reclaimed from the ice. The people who made these engravings were modern humans, of the same general type as the Red Lady of Paviland, of the same general type as the people who painted the cave at Lascaux. But they were now back in Britain, after thousands of years of absence, and they were beginning to feel at home again. After the Magdalenian came the Mesolithic, the long stable period from about 10,500 years ago to about 6,000 years ago. When the climate finally settled into something close to its modern pattern, the forests came back. The great cold steppe animals went extinct or retreated to the high latitudes. The rivers carved their modern courses, and the hunter-gatherer populations of Britain reached, at last, a kind of equilibrium with the landscape. The Mesolithic peoples lived all across the island. They had probably reached the far north of Scotland by about 9,000 years ago. They had probably reached every corner of the modern British coastline by about 8,000 years ago. They were hunting red deer and wild boar and aurochs and wildfowl, fishing the rivers and the coasts, gathering hazelnuts and other wild plant foods, in a way of life that had remained essentially unchanged across northern Europe for tens of thousands of years and would continue in Britain until the first farmers arrived. Cheddarman, the young man buried in Gough's cave, was one of these Mesolithic people. He was probably a hunter-gatherer of the standard Mesolithic type. He was dark-skinned, he had blue eyes, he had dark curly hair. He died young, probably violently. He was buried by his people, and his bones lay in the cave, in the warm dark, while the world above changed around him for 10,000 years, until the cave was rediscovered and his skeleton was lifted up into the light of a different world. But Cheddarman is not the only Mesolithic person whose remains lie in that particular cave. Gough's cave is one of the most haunting and most unsettling places in all of British prehistory, because in addition to Cheddarman himself, The cave contains the remains of at least 5 other individuals, dating from about 15,000 years ago, in the late Magdalenian period, and these other individuals were not buried. They were eaten. The cannibalism at Gough's Cave is one of the most clearly documented cases of human cannibalism anywhere in the prehistoric record. The bones of these 5 individuals, including 2 children and several adults, show systematic cut marks of the kind one would expect from butchery. The long bones have been cracked open for marrow. The brain cases have been carefully removed and shaped. 3 of the skulls, in particular, have been modified in a striking way, with the bottom and the back of the skull carefully cut away to leave only the upper brain case, which has then been smoothed at the edges and, in some interpretations, turned into a kind of cup or bowl. These so-called skull cups are not unique to Gough's Cave. They appear in a number of other late Paleolithic and Mesolithic sites across Europe. They seem to have been used, perhaps, as drinking vessels, perhaps in some kind of ritual context. We do not know whether the cannibalism at Gough's Cave was ritual, or starvation-driven, or warfare-related. We do not know whether these were enemies or kin. We do not know whether the eating was done with reverence, or with hostility, or with simple practical hunger. We know only that it happened, that the bones show it, that the cave preserved it, and that the people who came in and out of that cave 15,000 years ago, the Magdalenian people, the very early modern humans of post-Ice Age Britain, were doing things in there that we, with our modern sensibilities, find very difficult to think about for very long. That is one of the strange things about looking deep into the past. The people we find there are sometimes very recognizable and sometimes utterly strange, and most often they are both at once. They were people, the same kind of person as us, with the same basic minds and the same basic emotions, but they were also living in worlds so different from ours that the things they did, the choices they made, the values they held, are sometimes almost unrecognizable. The cannibal of Gough's Cave was a member of the same species as you. He may have looked very much like you, or like someone you know. He had a name in whatever language his people spoke. He had a family, somewhere. He had been a child once, and he would never get to be old. And he sat in a cave in Somerset 15,000 years ago, and he ate the brains out of the skull of another human being. And he turned that skull into a bowl, and then he, in his turn, presumably died, and was eaten in the same way by someone else, in the same cave, in the same long winter of the late Ice Age. These are the people who were here. These are the people who are buried under the layers, who left their bones for us to find. We do not have to like them. We do not have to imagine that they were good or wise or noble. We just have to look at them with as much honesty as we can manage and try to see who they actually were. The genetic story, when you look at the full sweep of it, is one of waves. Wave after wave of human population washing across the landscape of Europe and Britain, mixing partly with what came before, partly replacing it, partly being replaced in turn by what came after. The Aurignacian people of 40,000 years ago were largely replaced, genetically, by a slightly different wave of modern humans around 35,000 years ago, sometimes called the Gravettian. The Gravettians were in turn largely replaced by the Magdalenians of 15,000 years ago, who came back into northwest Europe from the southern refugia. The Magdalenians and their direct descendants in the Mesolithic, of which Cheddar Man is a representative, were then largely replaced around 6,000 years ago by the first farmers who arrived in Britain from the European mainland, bringing with them the techniques of agriculture and animal husbandry that had originated thousands of years earlier in the Near East. The farmers had different DNA. They were the descendants of Anatolian populations that had moved across Europe over the previous several thousand years, mixing with the local hunter-gatherers, but mostly replacing them. After the farmers came the Bronze Age peoples, around 4,500 years ago, who came from the steppes of Central Asia and brought with them the Indo-European languages that would become the ancestors of most modern European tongues, including English. The steppe peoples mixed with the farmers, but again, the genetic shift was huge. Recent ancient DNA studies have suggested that within a few centuries of their arrival, the Bronze Age newcomers had largely replaced the previous farming populations in Britain, contributing perhaps 90% of the genetic makeup of the new mixed population. Each of these waves brought changes. Each of them brought new technologies, new languages, new social structures, new appearances. The dark skin and the dark curly hair of Cheddar Man gave way, over the next few thousand years, to the lighter skins and lighter hair of the farmer and Bronze Age populations, as the genetic variants for those traits became dominant in the new mixed population. The proportions of Neanderthal DNA in the British population shifted slightly with each new wave, depending on which earlier populations the incomers had encountered and absorbed. The languages changed completely, more than once with each major demographic shift. The British people of 2,000 years ago, the Iron Age Britons who met the Roman invaders under Julius Caesar and then under Claudius, were already very different from the Mesolithic people of Cheddar Man's time. They were the product of thousands of years of mixing and immigration and adaptation. And the British people of today are different again, the product of further mixing in the Roman period, in the Anglo-Saxon period, in the Viking period, in the Norman period, and in all the centuries since. When you stand back and look at the whole long sweep of it, what you see is not a single British people inheriting a single British identity from a deep ancestral past. You see, instead, a long succession of different peoples, each of whom called this island home for a while, each of whom left some of their DNA in the people who came after them, but most of whom did not leave any direct descendants at all, in any meaningful sense. The Homo antecessor people of Happisburg have no living descendants. Their lineage went extinct in Europe, around 700,000 years ago. The Homo heidelbergensis people of Boxgrove have no living descendants either, except possibly through the chain of evolution that produced first the Neanderthals and then, distantly, ourselves, but no direct line of inheritance, no unbroken parent-to-child chain, reaches from the man with the spear at Boxgrove to any person alive today. The Neanderthals have no living descendants in the sense of a continuing species, although their DNA lives on, in tiny fragments, in almost every modern person whose ancestry traces outside Africa. The Aurignacian people of the Red Lady of Paviland have no living descendants in any direct sense. The Magdalenians have very few living descendants, mostly in small isolated populations in the Basque Country and a few other refugia. The Mesolithic people of Cheddar Man left only a tiny genetic trace in the modern British population, perhaps 10% at most, with the vast majority of modern British DNA coming from later arrivals. Each people, each species, each phase was complete in itself, lived its own lives, raised its own children, told its own stories, sang its own songs, and then was replaced, or absorbed, or scattered, or simply vanished, leaving the land to the next wave. And yet, despite all of that, the land remembers. The land does not forget. The bones are still in the gravels of the Thames. The footprints, for a few brief days, were back on the beach at Happisburg, before the sea took them again. The hand axes lie in the gravel pits and on the museum shelves in their tens of thousands, made by hands that have been gone for hundreds of thousands of years, but still as sharp and as beautiful as the day they were napped. The Linford mammoth bones still lie in the Norfolk sand, exactly where they fell. The skull of the Swanscombe woman is still in the museum case, with its thick bone and its long-ago smoothed surfaces. The teeth of the Pontnoid children are still in their jaws. The bones of the Red Lady of Paviland still hold their faint traces of ochre. the powdered iron oxide that was sprinkled on him by his mourners more than 30,000 years ago. Cheddar Man still lies in his quiet place in the museum, his blue eyes long gone, but his face now reconstructed from the data in his cells, looking out at us with a kind of patient, questioning expression, as if he were asking us a question that he has been waiting 10,000 years to have answered. The land remembers, the sediments remember, the DNA inside our own cells remembers, in fragments we cannot consciously access, but which are there all the same. The Neanderthal genes from 40,000 years ago, the unknown other archaic ancestries that we are only beginning to suspect, the deep, ancient layers of who we are that go back, generation by generation, parent to child, in an unbroken chain reaching all the way back to the people at Happisburgh and beyond. What does it all mean? That is a question I cannot answer for you, in the dark of the night, with you lying in your bed and me only a voice. What does it mean to live on an island that has been the home of so many different kinds of person, that has been emptied and filled again, that has been buried under ice and exposed to the sun, that has been a peninsula and an archipelago and an island, that has carried the lives and the deaths of so many millions of people, only the tiniest fraction of whom we will ever know anything about? What does it mean to look at a flint-hand axe in a museum case and know that someone made it with their own hands 500,000 years ago, and that whatever they were thinking as they made it is gone forever and unrecoverable? What does it mean to know that the very DNA in your own cells carries pieces of people who were not your species, who looked nothing like you, who lived and died in caves and on cold steppes and in flooded fenlands tens of thousands of years before any human history was written down? What does it mean to know that everything we now call Britain, with its cities and its motorways and its small old towns and its long literary traditions, is only the very surface layer, the thin scum on the top of a much deeper history that goes down and down and down into times so ancient that the human mind can scarcely encompass them? I do not have an answer to that question. I do not think there is a single answer to it. The best I can offer is this. The land we walk on was walked on, before us, by many other kinds of people. Some of them were a little like us. Some of them were very different. All of them were, in their own ways, doing what people do, hunting, gathering, raising children, burying their dead, making tools, telling stories around fires, in languages we will never hear, looking up at the same sky, with the same moon, and feeling, perhaps, some of the same feelings that we feel when we look at it ourselves. They were here. We are here now. Someone, perhaps, will be here after us. The land will outlast all of us. The story will go on, with or without anyone to tell it. The Homo antecessor family at Happisburgh, walking with their children across the muddy estuary in the cold morning light, 900,000 years ago. The man at Boxgrove with his spear, standing over the dead horse in the autumn dawn, 500,000 years ago. The Swanscombe woman in her early 20s, dying for reasons we do not know, 400,000 years ago, in the warm green forests of the Hoxnean interglacial. The Neanderthal children at Pontnevid, in their small cave high in the Welsh hillside, 230,000 years ago. The Neanderthal hunters at Linford, surrounding the bogged-down mammoths in the cold Norfolk marsh, 60,000 years ago. The unknown Neanderthal individuals at La Cotte, driving game over the granite cliffs of Jersey, in deep winter, again and again, for tens of thousands of years. The first modern human, perhaps a young person, who dropped their lower jaw fragment in the back of Kent's Cavern, 44,000 years ago, on the very edge of a world that was about to change forever. The Red Lady of Paviland, the young man buried in the cave in South Wales with his sprinkled ochre and his ivory rods and his periwinkle shells, looking out over what was then a tundra plain, but is now the cold grey waters of the Bristol Channel, 33,000 years ago. The Magdalenian artists at Creswell Crags, scratching their bison and their ibex and their ambiguous bird onto the cave walls 13,000 years ago, by the light of small bowl lamps fed with animal fat. The cannibals of Gough's Cave, with their carefully shaped skull cups, eating their dead in the long winters of 15,000 years ago, for reasons we cannot now know. Cheddar Man, the dark-skinned, blue-eyed young man, dying of a head wound and being buried by his people in the same cave where, 5,000 years before, the cannibals had done their work. All of them were here. All of them lived their full lives in this same place. All of them are part of the long story that has produced, eventually, the world we now know. The names we have given them are our names, made up by scientists in laboratories long after the fact. The species labels, the chronological periods, the cultural designations. These are tools of thought, useful for organizing the evidence, but they do not really capture what those lives were like from the inside. The Homo antecessor parent walking with their children along the Happisburgh estuary did not know they were Homo antecessor. They knew themselves by some name we will never know, in some language we will never hear, and they thought of themselves simply as people, the way we think of ourselves simply as people, with all the same daily concerns of food and warmth and family and safety and the unknown future just over the next horizon. The Boxgrove hunter with his spear did not know he was a Heidelbergensis. He was just a man, doing his work, providing for his family in the morning light of an autumn day. The Swanscombe woman did not know that her skull would be found in 3 pieces by 3 different men over a span of 20 years, and that her face would be reconstructed and her brain capacity calculated and her position in the human family tree debated by scientists who would not be born for 400,000 years. She was just a young woman, living her life until she was not anymore. The Neanderthal hunters at Linford did not know they were Neanderthals. They were simply people, the only kind of people they had ever known. The terror of being labelled, of being categorized, of being slotted into a chart of evolutionary relationships is entirely modern. They did not have it. They were just here. They were just alive. They were just living, the way everything that has ever lived has lived, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time, in the small, specific present moment that was all they ever really had. That is perhaps the deepest lesson of the deep human past. That every one of those people, across the 900,000-year span of the story we have walked through tonight, was alive in exactly the same way you are alive now. The same kind of consciousness, the same kind of perception of the world, the same sense of self and other and time and place. Whatever their bodies looked like, whatever their brains were shaped like, whatever their tools and their languages and their customs, they all had this one thing in common with you. They were here, alive, in the world, looking out from behind their own eyes, the only one of themselves that they would ever be, in the only time they would ever have. The cold breath in the morning air, the warmth of the fire in the evening, the taste of the meat, the weight of the child in their arms, the feel of the stone under their hands as they worked it into a tool, the sound of the rain on the leaves above their heads as they sheltered through a long night. All of that was the same for them as it is for you. All of that was the great central fact of being alive, then as now, then as ever, then as it will always be for whoever comes after. And so, if there is any meaning in the long story we have walked through tonight, perhaps it is this: that we are not alone in our being alive, that we have never been alone, that the world has been full, for nearly 1 million years, of other people, of different kinds, in different bodies, with different minds, who were nevertheless all doing the same essential thing, just being alive, here, on this land, under this same sky. The cold morning at Happisburgh, with the family walking together, the autumn day at Boxgrove, with the men standing over the horse, the warm afternoon at Swanscombe, with the young woman looking out over the river, the winter night at Pontonavid, with the children sleeping in the cave, the frozen marsh at Linford, with the hunters waiting for the mammoth to stop moving, the granite cliff at La Cotte, with the people watching the herd come towards them, driven by their cousins from the other side, the deep cave at Paviland, with the body of the young man being placed in his grave and the red ochre being sprinkled over him, the flickering lamplight at Creswell, with the artist working on the cave wall, the dark cave at Guff's, with whatever was happening there, the same cave again, with Cheddarman being laid into his grave 10,000 years ago. All of these moments, all of these lives, all of these long ago people, who were not us, but who were here, on this island, before us. They were here, they lived, they mattered. The land carries them all, just as it will one day, in its quiet way, carry whatever is left of us. The night is very late now. You may already be asleep. That is fine. The story has done its work, whether you have heard all of it or only the first part. The voice has carried you, for a long time, through a very long stretch of time. We started at the beach at Happisburgh in the cold dawn, with the footprints just uncovered by the storm. We walked, very slowly, through nearly 1,000,000 years of the human story on this island, meeting, one by one, the different kinds of person who have lived here. The Homo antecessor of the deepest past, the Homo heidelbergensis of the great hand axes, the Neanderthals of the cold long winters, the Homo sapiens, ourselves, in our earliest and darkest, skinned and most ancient form, arriving for the first time, taking the land from those who had had it before. And then we walked, quickly, through the more recent waves, the farmers and the Bronze Age peoples and all the rest, who would build the layers of British identity that we now know. The names came and went, the species came and went, the very shape of the island came and went, the ice came down and went back, the forest came and went, the sea rose and fell and rose again. Through all of it, the land was here, and through all of it, there have been people, of different kinds, looking at the same horizon, breathing the same air, living the same kind of lives, in their own small specific time and place, that all people have always lived. Sleep now. The story is told for tonight. The bones are still in the ground where we left them at the start. The flint axes are still in their cases. The cave walls still hold their faint, scratched figures of bison and deer. The DNA of all those long-ago people is still in the cells of everyone now alive, in fragments we will probably spend the next century slowly unraveling. The story is not finished. It will never be finished. We are still in it. We are the latest layer, the most recent species. The current incumbents of an island that has had many tenants and will have many more. Whatever comes after us will inherit something from us, just as we have inherited fragments from everyone who came before. The chain is unbroken. The land remembers. The night is long. There is no rush. Sleep well if you can. The deep past is still here, all around you, in the bones beneath the soil, in the cells inside your own body, in the slow, quiet rhythms of the very old land you live on. The hand still grips the spear at Boxgrove, in some kind of way, after 500,000 years. The family still walks at Happisburgh, in some kind of way, after 900,000. They are still there. They were here. They lived. They mattered. And so do you. And so do all of us. In our turn, in our small specific moment, in the long, deep time that the land is still keeping for us. Good night.